People on the right know the mainstream media is against them. They know the institutions that exist in the Canadian government and the bureaucracy are against them. But there's a real threat that often goes ignored when it comes to the potential for Conservatives to win another election. Now, one of the things we saw in the October election is that the Conservative Party of Canada can win more votes than anyone else, but still not have enough seats to form Parliament. And if this can happen when all the stars have aligned and the circumstances are right there, what would it take for the Conservatives to win again in Canada? Well, it's going to be very difficult if the continued trend of the rise of the public sector keeps going on. The public sector is oftentimes the only industry in Canada that grows, and a lot of the time this happens at the same point that the private sector is in decline or in some cases even receding. I caught up with Catherine Swift, who's formerly the head of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, the CFIB, and now is one of the founders of Working Canadians, where she serves as a spokesperson trying to put a pro-Canadian and pro-business mindset towards policy and politics. Now, what Working Canadians is up against is millions upon millions upon millions of dollars put into the political process by public sector unions, almost exclusively with the goal of defeating Conservatives. This is my interview with Catherine Swift in Alberta about how we push back against the rise of public sector political influence. So let's talk, Catherine, a little bit about one of the biggest issues we see in Conservative parties that are trying to campaign and finding they're up against monumental resistance from what seems in some part of the country like the only industry that's growing, which is the public sector. How on earth can we ever break through what seems to be the trend that left-wing parties are being championed by these massive operations, massive ad campaigns? What's the answer to that?
Well, I think, Andrew, we have to go broke. No, I'm not trying to be too sarcastic or facetious, but part of the evil part of me often thinks, well, maybe we'll just go broke, and then people will ultimately understand what a huge problem this is. Because you're absolutely right. We've seen over the last 20 years or so, in particular, provincially, federally, and even municipally, we've seen a massive escalation of participation by public sector unions, all of these third-party groups that often you look at them and you think, oh, what is that all about? Oh, in Ontario, it's called Working Families. Isn't that nice? Isn't that a nice, cozy little group? Of course, it's nothing but supported by unions, So often you don't even know what these entities are, but they're participating exceedingly actively, giving money, but also putting boots on the ground in many of these election campaigns. So it's not just as simple as the election rules that only permit a given group to spend, X dollars, $500,000 was the federal number most recently, and so on. They also do all kinds of in-kind stuff that I believe is probably at least as valuable as the actual purchased advertising they do and that kind of thing. So, the answer is none of them are easy, because a lot of it has to do with things like rules around how, on the left, the union spending is by far the largest. It tends to be 80 to 90% of the spending in any given election over the last number of years. So people say, the big corporations aren't spending a minuscule portion of what the unions are spending. So part of it obviously is to oppose this with groups on the other side of the spectrum, and that is happening. There are a number of groups that are springing up, but the reality is the unions have a massive flow of money they don't earn, because Canada's a unique country in the world that permits the forcing of union dues. So if you're in a unionized workplace, you have to pay those dues whether or not you like how they're going to be spent. Zero financial accountability on the part of those unions as to how they're spending the dues, and spending them politically willy-nilly. In many countries, this would be illegal. So obviously there's a legal answer here to some extent. I don't think that's imminent, because frankly our courts have been excessively sympathetic and positive toward the participation of unions and giving unions all this power that frankly they don't deserve. So I don't see that, unless something changes quite radically in the near future, I don't see that really as a solution. But I do think having groups presenting the other side of the story is part of the answer. Part of the answer also, though, is getting the information out. I think if most voters knew these are self-interested unions that basically want to pick your pocket even more than they're already picking it, they're the ones that are trying to sway your vote, then getting that word out much more effectively than has been done to date is a really key part of this as well. Of course, ultimately, the ideal would be get rid of things like forced union dues, impose transparency, because I think a lot of union members, if they had a clue how much of their money was being spent on partisan political activism, they would be pretty disgruntled with that and start to demand some changes. So, those are just some of the solutions that I think are feasible. I don't think in the short term, though, the sort of legal side, the ultimate answer is the legal stuff that will actually constrain this kind of spending completely. But perhaps that's, again, if you could manage to do it, to prevent any spending by unions or even corporations. We've gone a little bit to that because we now, only permit individuals to donate to certain candidates' campaigns and so on. But I think we could go further. But again, the beneficiary governments get elected. Are they going to enact these changes? Of course not, because they're the ones that are benefiting from it.
The flip side that you hear from the unions is that they obviously have a reason to get involved, and that's that they're voting in their self-interest. Most people vote in their self-interest, and they say it's a free speech issue. Why shouldn't they be allowed to enter the process? So what's your answer to that? Why not just open the floodgates, let unions get involved, let corporations get involved, let any group that has the resources put them towards that process?
Because, and I'm a big free speech advocate, so don't get me wrong on that front, but in this case, they're not equal players. These are not equal players here. As I mentioned earlier, the unions have this guaranteed flow of money that, frankly, they could not lift a finger and they would still be getting billions of dollars if you add it all up across the country. It's billions of dollars every single year to spend however they choose. A corporation is not in that position. If they do something stupid, they might go out of business. They might severely see their stock price drop. They might lose a lot of investors and on and on and on. So they're not equal players that you can apply these free speech arguments to in a fair, level playing field kind of way. The other thing to look at, which I think is probably the most important one, is what is the ultimate end game for society? And given that the unions, their only growth source right now is government. Unions are dying in the private sector. They can't compete. They were fine back in the sort of heavy industrial age and so on and so forth. Now that globalization and, of course, technological change has really taken a bite out of their bottom line, you'll find the unions are moving so much toward the government side. And of course, the ultimate impact of having public sector union friendly governments in power in perpetuity is we do go bankrupt as a country. In the interim, we already have the reality that a government worker makes considerably more money than the identical job in the private sector would pay. They have much better pension arrangements that, by the way, are increasingly going broke these days as the population ages. So we are paying more and more. We the private sector taxpayer, are paying more and more for that. So again, I think to look at what the end result is of just letting her rip in terms of what everybody, what any group is spending out there, you have to look at how destructive the impact of that is. At least businesses do contribute to society, to our tax base, to the bottom line. Unions do not. They just take the money, and all the union-funded groups as well. Because frankly, when you look at where all the money's coming from, it's not exclusively unions, but the vast majority of it is. So I think it has to be focused on, and people need to realize, free speech is one thing, hugely important, of course, but the pernicious impact of letting this unfettered spending coming from this part of the economy is so destructive to our society and our economy ultimately as a whole that it can't be treated equally to other players in the mix.
You look at cities like Edmonton, London, Hamilton, a lot of these suburban communities, the only industries growing in these cities are public sector, social services, federal, provincial, municipal government. What's the short-term and long-term impact of this trend when you see in Alberta, for example, economic downturn in the private sector, but government still manages to grow?
Yeah, well, of course, in Alberta, they, that election of that NDP government, which I'm sure a lot of people are regretting now, it was a big factor there because you even had a premier whose spouse was a public sector union leader. So, where's their bread going to be buttered? Not much of a shocker there. But you're right; it's very worrisome. The Trudeau government has loved to boast about job creation, but when you look down where the jobs are being created, so many of them are public sector or quasi-public sector or so-called social enterprises, which is a new insidious form. They sort of pretend to be businesses, but they're basically supported by government. So they're not true businesses. But the proliferation of all of these entities it's a drag on our economy, on our society, and ultimately too, they tend to drive out the truly private businesses who are the big contributors to our bottom line as a country, as a province, as any government. So again, the end game is not pretty. I often wonder if any of these public sector entities ever think out more than the next couple of years or maybe their next collective bargaining agreement. Because when you look at the countries that actually have gone broke, or the jurisdictions, Detroit, it's an example, Greece, of course, the infamous Grecian formula, as I like to refer to it, and other countries that have teetered on the brink, who ends up suffering the worst? The public sector workers do, because suddenly they see those pensions they were counting on sliced in half. I spoke at this conference to a woman who has relatives in Ireland, and they were visiting recently, and there was some teachers there. It just so happened were expecting to retire at 54. They just recently found out that's going to be 68 now because their pension is so badly underfunded. I mean, these are anecdotal, but do you think that's not going to happen here? In Canada, a lot of these pension plans of public sector workers are in danger. So, obviously we need a little more perspective here into looking out a decade or two, not just the next year or so. But yeah, it's a very worrisome trend that you end up with the government sector or the sort of quasi-government sector growing and growing and growing because. Once again, let's look through history. Do we see this as a successful strategy for any country, for any economy? The old East German model, that was a fiasco. The old line about socialism is sharing misery equally comes to mind. So these are very, very worrisome trends. They should worry all Canadians, including those who currently say, hey, I'm in government, I'm good, I got job security, I got this big fat pension. Well, folks, the bottomless pit of taxpayer, pockets isn't really bottomless. It can be, the bottom can be reached. And unfortunately, we see a lot of surveys now that say things like, an inordinate number of Canadians are $200 away from, bankruptcy, or, everybody's worried. The last election, everybody was worried about, sort of just bread and butter, cost of living, affordability issues. And so in Canada, I think we're not too far from some really worrisome trends. And of course, a nice whacking Great Recession is a trigger, unfortunately, that could set a lot of this mess in motion. So yeah, there's no easy answers because obviously we need to, the average voter also needs to say, even if they're not a government worker or whatever, that, gee, this political party has promised me the moon. And of course, even the Conservatives were doing it in the last federal election, all this spending planned, but ultimately it's all coming out of our pockets.
Yes, here at True North, we are putting forward a perspective that you just aren't getting from the mainstream media. We can't do this alone. If you can chip in a few dollars a month to support the work we're doing by going to tnc.news and joining the Andrew Lawton Heritage Club, it would be mightily appreciated. For True North, I'm Andrew Lawton.